Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're really zeroing in on the recent talk around trade with China. We'll be looking specifically at statements and reports from, well, a few sources. Live Now from FOX, CNN News 18, and also a Fox Business article. They've got excerpts of the former president's views. Our aim here is to, dig into the key claims, the actions being proposed, and just the overall story being presented in these sources about U.S.-China trade. Okay, let's get into it.
Yeah, and what strikes you right away looking at these sources is a really consistent perspective on the U.S.-China trade relationship. There's definitely a clear story being told about past economic disadvantages for the U.S. and a very strong focus on how trade deals should look going forward.
Exactly. So let's start with how the past is being framed. That Live Now from FOX video, it makes this really strong claim, doesn't it, about the U.S. losing, $2 trillion a year on trade. And the message is, basically, those days are done. The U.S. is going to be making money now. And the narrative kind of pushes further, suggesting that under the current administration, things got worse. Like figures like $3 to $5 billion a day, even $1 trillion a year in losses. Those are, pretty big numbers.
They certainly grab your attention. And, just for a bit of context, it's probably worth remembering that the total trade goods and services between the U.S. and China in a recent year was around $700 billion.
Okay.
So when you hear these claims about trillions in losses, it also circles back to trade deficits. That's the difference between imports and exports, right?
Yeah.
Now, a trade deficit isn't necessarily like a direct cash loss for the country's books, but it's often seen, especially by some, as a sign of, an imbalance in how countries trade with each other. And that perceived imbalance is definitely central to the viewpoint in these sources we're looking at.
Right. And the main tool being discussed to fix this perceived imbalance is tariffs. The former president, again, in that Live Now from FOX transcript, he brings up history. He talks about the period from about 1870 to 1913. He states the U.S. didn't have an income tax then and was the wealthiest country, and he attributes that wealth to tariffs. And following that historical point, there's this suggestion that, taxes could come down substantially once this whole trade thing is, quote, finished.
Yeah, that historical comparison is it's an interesting way to frame the pro-tariff argument.
Yeah.
It sort of presents them as this foundational driver of American prosperity, at least in that specific era. I mean, basically, a tariff is just a tax on goods coming into the country, right? And the effect is it can make those imported goods pricier for people and businesses here, which potentially makes the stuff made domestically look more attractive price-wise. So the idea being floated is that using tariffs smartly strengthens the U.S. economy, and then maybe you can cut other taxes.
Okay, now let's talk about that specific number, 145%. It keeps cropping up regarding tariffs on China. It's in the Fox Business piece, the CNN News 18 video.
Right, that very high figure.
Yeah. And while it's acknowledged as very high, there's also clarification that the overall tariff level won't be that high. Apparently, this specific percentage was also connected to discussions about fentanyl somehow. But the clear message seems to be, look, tariffs will come down substantially, but they won't be zero.
It does suggest maybe a negotiating tactic, doesn't it? You float a really high potential rate, perhaps just to create some leverage.
Okay.
Even if you don't actually plan to implement that specific number across the board, just suggesting it can, shift the conversation. And the fact that they're committed to keeping some tariff signals, a continued belief that they work, that they're a useful tool for shaping trade and protecting industries here.
And the feeling seems to be that this leverage is, pretty significant. You see statements in both the Live Now and CNN News 18 transcripts saying China has to make a deal, or they risk not being able to trade with the U.S. at all. It suggested the U.S. will basically set the deal if it comes down to it. And adding to that, the CNN News 18 transcript mentions, reportedly from the trade team, something like 18 proposals on paper from different countries wanting trade deals with the U.S.
So that paints a picture of the U.S. really holding strong cards in international trade. Other countries are lining up wanting to engage on U.S. terms. Although it's also worth noting that Fox News transcript did mention that direct talks with China at the very top levels might not have actually started yet when these reports came out.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, so it kind of raises a question about where things actually stand in terms of high-level engagement, despite all the talk about wanting deals.
That is an interesting potential contrast, yeah. Because despite that tough negotiating talk, there's also, in the Live Now video, mention of wanting a fair deal with China. And the CNN News 18 report describes having a great relationship with President Xi Jinping. Plus, there's this belief stated that China will still do fine even under a new agreement. So it's kind of a mix, isn't it? Tough talk, but also saying, hey, we want something that works for everyone.
Well, you could certainly see that combination as a kind of strategic approach to negotiation. Project strength, project resolve, create maybe a better environment for the actual talks, and then expressing the desire for fairness, acknowledging China can still do well. Maybe that's an attempt to keep the door open, to suggest a win-win is actually possible here.
Okay, let's widen the lens a bit. Look at the broader international picture. That Live Now transcript claims every country wants to deal with the U.S., even, quote, those who ripped us off in the past. And then the Fox News transcript adds another layer, suggesting a U.S. goal is to get other countries to sort of isolate China, the idea being that gives the U.S. more leverage. But that same report pointed out the EU was pushing back against decoupling from China. Decoupling, meaning, trying to significantly cut economic ties.
And that really just highlights how complicated global trade is, doesn't it? I mean, one country might want to pursue a certain strategy, but other countries have their own economic interests, their own political priorities. The EU's reported position just shows that getting everyone on the same page to say, isolate China economically probably isn't straightforward. These are complex, long-standing relationships.
Definitely. And finally, maybe we should touch on some of the sort of underlying feelings expressed here. There's this desire mentioned in the Live Now transcript for a country that people can be proud of, not a laughingstock. And that seems connected to this broader theme of, stopping the U.S. from being ripped off by every country in the world.
Yeah, that definitely speaks to a feeling of national economic pride and a desire to reestablish what's seen as a better, more advantageous position for the U.S. in the world economy. It's really an appeal to this sentiment of restoring balance, making sure American economic interests come first.
So, okay, wrapping up this deep dive then, the key themes that really stand out are this strong narrative about past trade disadvantages for the U.S.
Right, the focus on tariffs as a strategic tool.
The expectation of some kind of future deal with China with tariffs that are lower, but definitely not gone.
And this broader geopolitical angle where the U.S. is trying to use its position to influence global trade dynamics.
Exactly.
Which brings us, I think, to a really crucial question for you, the listener, to think about. When you consider all these statements, these reported developments, what are the potential consequences, short-term, long-term, for the whole global economy? And maybe think beyond just the stated goals. What other factors, what hidden currents do you think will ultimately shape how U.S.-China trade relations actually play out in the future?